Autumn of 2003, on a gray gravel road outside of Olds in the foothills of central Alberta, a 41-year-old woman named Vivian Marsh spent $2,300 on 12 secondhand rain barrels, 4 rolls of perforated drainage pipe, and a soil amendment she'd ordered from a supplier in Lethbridge whose catalog nobody at the Olds Farm and Feed had ever bothered to stock. The barrels were dark green, the kind used for commercial composting. The pipe was flexible, corrugated, the color of old clay. The supplier's name was handwritten on the invoice in a script that suggested he'd learned penmanship from someone who took it seriously. Vivian loaded the barrels into the back of her '99 GMC Sierra herself, 2 at a time, rolling them on their rims across the gravel lot, while the man at the loading dock watched without offering to help. She thanked him for the invoice, folded it into her jacket pocket, and drove the 45 minutes back to Clearwater County on the highway with the radio tuned to the farm report, and then turned off somewhere past Innisfail because the cattle prices were going the wrong way, and she didn't want to think about that yet. When she turned off the township road onto her property, the sky was the particular flat white of an Alberta October. That means winter is not asking permission. Her neighbor, Ray Elwick, was burning deadfall in the ditch on the far side of his fence line. He watched her drive past. He could see the green barrels in the truck bed. He raised a hand because that was what you did. Vivian raised a hand back. Ray watched the truck disappear up her lane and then looked back at his fire and thought that was a lot of barrels for one woman. That was how it started. Over the next 5 years, the townships around the little community of Bowden would have a story about Vivian Marsh. It was the kind of story that travels in the particular way stories travel in small agricultural communities. From the feed store to the elevator, from the elevator to the rink, from the rink to the curling club, and at every stop it got a little longer and a little more certain of itself. And at the center of the story was a woman who, by every outward measure, appeared to be doing something that made no practical sense. Let me tell you who Vivian Marsh was before the story started, because the story doesn't make sense without that. Vivian was born in 1962 in Red Deer, the eldest of 3 children. Her mother, June, worked the desk at a livestock auction house. Her father, Harold Whitmore, ran a mixed grain and beef operation 12 kilometers east of Innisfail on land that had been in the family since her great-uncle broke sod on a quarter section in 1928. The land was flat in the way that central Alberta is flat, which is not entirely flat, but flat enough that you can watch weather come from 50 kilometers away and know you have time to finish the row before it arrives. Harold was not a man who wasted words, but he was a man who wasted nothing else. He kept a log, not a formal record, just a green hardcover notebook from the drugstore in Innisfail in which he wrote down what happened to his land, the way other men wrote down hockey scores, rainfall amounts, first frost, which field he planted to what, where the water pooled after a heavy rain, where it didn't pool when it should have. When Vivian was old enough to walk the fields with him, he made her pay attention. Not in the way a teacher means pay attention, in the way that means you look at a thing until you understand what it's trying to tell you. He had an expression he used when she'd rush past something. He'd say quietly without stopping walking, "You haven't looked at it yet." That was all. She learned to stop. Vivian married Peter Marsh in 1988. Peter was a cattle and hay operation out of Clearwater County, a careful, unhurried man who had grown up on the same land he now farmed and who measured decisions in seasons, not days. They ran about 180 head of black Angus on 900 acres and put up hay on another 120 that Peter had rented from a neighbor for 15 years. It was a modest living in the way that mixed farming in central Alberta is modest, not desperate, not comfortable in any way you could photograph, but enough if you were the kind of people who knew what enough looked like. Peter died in March of 2001, an aneurysm in the kitchen a Wednesday morning. He was 47 years old. Vivian had been outside in the calving barn and came in at 7 to find him. She called 911 from the landline and then went back to the barn because there were 2 cows still to check, and she did not know what else to do with her hands. Her sister drove up from Calgary that weekend and sat with her at the kitchen table and suggested carefully that selling might be the thing to do. Take the equity, lease the land, move closer to services. Vivian listened to all of it. She thanked her sister for coming. Then she went out to the shop to check on a hydraulic line that had been weeping all February and hadn't been fixed yet. She managed alone for the next 2 years before the land started telling her something she couldn't ignore. What Vivian saw when she walked her fields in those years was what her father had taught her to see. She saw it because she still walked them. Not from the cab of the tractor, not from the truck on the township road. On foot, in the way Harold Whitmore had walked his fields, slowly, looking down. What she saw was water, specifically the absence of it where it should have been and the presence of it where it shouldn't. Her north quarter held water in the spring for 3 weeks after the snow melted and didn't drain properly until nearly June, which shortened her haying window by a month and compacted the crown of the field every year. Her south field, the one she depended on for the first cut, had patches where the soil had gone tight and gray-brown, where rain hit it and sheeted off rather than soaking in, where the grass was thin in a way that grass shouldn't be thin on land, that got adequate rainfall. The ditches along the south fence were silting. The culvert under the field approach had been replaced twice in 8 years. She had been reading, not the crop insurance bulletins that arrived in the mail and went into a pile on the corner of the desk, something different, a land drainage manual published by a soil scientist at the University of Saskatchewan, and a series of bulletins from an organization in Manitoba that had been studying soil health in the prairie provinces for 20 years. The idea that kept appearing in everything she read was not a complicated idea. It was almost aggravating in its simplicity once she understood it. Prairie soil loses its capacity to absorb water when it's compacted. Compaction comes from heavy equipment, from cattle on wet ground, from repeated cultivation that destroys soil structure. The solution isn't to drain water faster. The solution is to restore the soil's capacity to receive it. That means organic matter. That means mycorrhizal networks. That means reducing compaction and adding biological material and letting the soil rebuild its own architecture from below. To do that at any scale, you needed to capture water rather than divert it. You needed to slow it down at the source, hold it at the surface long enough for it to infiltrate, and add the biological inoculants that would let the soil microbiome do the rest, which was why Vivian drove to Lethbridge for 12 rain barrels and perforated pipe and an inoculant product that the man at the Olds Farm and Feed had looked at for a long moment before saying he'd never heard of it. She started on the north quarter. She installed the perforated pipe in a shallow trench along the high side of the low spot, not to move water out, but to distribute it laterally into the soil at the edge of the problem area. She positioned 4 of the rain barrels to catch the runoff from the machine shed roof, inoculated the overflow pathway with the biological material, and let it work. It was slow. It looked from the road like she had put garbage bins along the side of a perfectly ordinary field. The barrels were what people noticed first. Gordon Smedley, who ran the elevator at Bowden and knew the farm business of most of the county, had passed Vivian's place on the way to his daughter's property in late November and counted 6 green barrels visible from the road. He mentioned it at the elevator the following week. His assistant, a young man named Kyle, had driven past the north quarter and seen the trench. "She's got pipe going into the low spot," Kyle said. "Not out of it, into it, like she's trying to put water in." Gordon looked at him. "That can't be right," he said. Kyle said he was pretty sure. Gordon thought about it for a moment and then shook his head in the slow way of a man deciding not to think about something anymore. Ray Elwick, the neighbor who had watched the truck come in with the barrels, stopped Vivian on the road in December. He was a decent man, Ray. Not unfriendly, not unkind. He asked how the calves had wintered and then, carefully, whether she was having trouble with the drainage on the north quarter. She said she was working on it. He nodded. There was a pause. "I had a look," he said, "from the road." Another pause. "That pipe doesn't go anywhere." "It goes down," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded again and said he hoped the calves wintered all right. The story that formed over the next 2 winters was told with something between sympathy and entertainment. It went like this. Vivian Marsh had taken on the farm alone after Peter died, and she was managing fine. Everyone agreed on that. But she'd gotten hold of some university idea about soil biology, and she was out there on the north quarter with those green barrels and that pipe system that didn't seem to go anywhere useful. She'd ordered biological material from down south. Nobody quite knew what it was, and she was treating her fields like a science project rather than a working operation. She wasn't a foolish woman, but farming and water management in central Alberta had been steadily practiced for a long time, and whatever they were studying at the University of Saskatchewan wasn't necessarily going to translate to Clearwater County. The story was not cruel. That matters. It was the story of a community watching someone they respected do something they couldn't follow, and worrying about her in the particular way that rural communities worry about people who have lost a spouse and might not be thinking straight. Ray Elwick mentioned it to his wife over supper. His wife told the woman who sat next to her at the curling club that woman's husband stopped for a moment on the township road in April of the second year and looked at the north quarter and could not quite explain what he was looking at, but drove on because it wasn't his business. In the second year, 2004, Vivian added something that made the story more definite. She stopped baling the margins of her south field, the edges within 10 meters of the fence lines, and left them as permanent grass buffer strips. She seeded them deliberately with a native grass mix she'd sourced from a seed producer outside of Camrose, Plains rough fescue, June grass, northern wheatgrass. She put up a small sign on the gate post, not for anyone else, just so she could remember what she'd seeded and when. To anyone driving the township road, it looked like she wasn't finishing her field, like she was leaving money on the table. Gordon Smedley drove past in September and counted the uncut margins and felt the particular discomfort of watching someone he respected make what appeared to be an economic error. What Vivian was doing in those margins was not leaving money on the table. She was buying herself a filtration system she couldn't afford to build with pipe and concrete. The buffer strips would slow the surface runoff that was silting her ditches. They would hold the topsoil that had been sheeting off the south field for 15 years. They would eventually begin to rebuild the organic layer at the field edge that had been stripped by continuous cultivation to the fence line. She did not explain this to anyone. She was her father's daughter in that way. She was also, in the evenings after the work was done, talking by email and occasional telephone with two other producers, one in Saskatchewan and one in Manitoba, who were doing similar things on their operations. These exchanges were specific and long. What biological inoculants worked in which soil temperature range, how many seasons before you could measure infiltration rate changes, what to do with municipal water quality data if you were near a drainage district. Her phone bill was higher. Her internet usage was higher. This was noticed in the way that things are noticed in communities where the social fabric is maintained by attention to detail. By the second winter, if you asked about Vivian Marsh at the elevator in Bowden, people would say she was managing fine, and then there would be a small pause and someone might mention the barrels. In 2005, the results that Vivian had been watching for began to be tentatively visible. In the north quarter, the low spot that had held water until June for as long as anyone could remember, drained by the third week of May. Not entirely, she was careful about that, but enough that she was able to get the tractor into the field 12 days earlier than she had in any of the previous 4 years. She measured this. She wrote it down in a green hardcover notebook she'd bought at the drugstore in Innisfail because it was the kind her father had used. In the south field, the bare patches were smaller. Not gone. She wouldn't say gone. But the boundary of the bare area in the southwest corner had retreated by perhaps 3 meters from where it had been when she first measured it with stakes and orange survey tape in the fall of 2003. The grass at the edge of the buffer strips was establishing. The ditch along the south fence had not silted since the previous fall, and the culvert was clear. She did not mention any of this in town. She did not mention it because she was her father's daughter and her father had believed that a good year was a private thing until it had proven itself past the point of argument. In the spring of 2005, a graduate student from the University of Alberta named Chloe Arsenault knocked on Vivian's door. She was writing a thesis on soil hydrology in the Northern Prairie Transition Zone, and a professor in Edmonton had mentioned that there was a producer in Clearwater County who had been experimenting with biological infiltration enhancement. The county's agricultural fieldman had given Chloe the same look Gordon Smedley had given Kyle at the elevator, but had eventually given her a name. Vivian made tea. She took Chloe out to both fields for 2 hours. Chloe was 26 and had grown up in Sherwood Park and knew soil from core samples rather than from walking it since childhood. But she was methodical, and she asked the right kind of questions, the kind that meant she was actually listening to the answers rather than fitting them into a framework she'd already decided on. She asked to come back in June to take measurements. She wanted infiltration rate data, organic matter percentages, and a species count from the buffer strips. Vivian said yes. Chloe came back in June with a double-ring infiltrometer and a colleague and spent 4 days taking measurements across Vivian's fields and on the adjacent parcels. She called Vivian in September. Her voice had the careful quality of someone who has results she doesn't quite know how to present yet. The infiltration rate in the treated areas of the North Quarter was, she said, 34% higher than in the untreated sections. The organic matter percentage in the top 5 centimeters of soil in the buffer strip areas was 2.1%, compared to 0.8% in the continuously cultivated sections of the South Field. The species count in the buffer strips was 14 native species, established in 2 years from a seeded mix. There was a pause on the line. "Those are real numbers," Chloe said. "That's not noise, that's signal." Vivian thanked her, wrote the figures in the green notebook, and put the notebook in the filing cabinet in the back bedroom that served as her office. She did not call anyone. She went out and checked the water troughs on the south pasture and stood in the field for a while with her hands in her jacket pockets and the Alberta sky going dark above the tree line to the west. She had been waiting 3 years for a number she could trust. The number was there, but the field itself was the real number, and she had known what it was saying before Chloe Arsenault had ever knocked on her door. In the summer of 2006, Alberta got dry. Not catastrophically dry, not 1988, not 2002, but the July that came that year was the kind of July that finds the difference between land in good health and land that is not. Precipitation in Clearwater County was 62% of the historical average from the 1st of July to the 15th of August. Pastures went dormant. Hay yields came in short. The canola on the heavy soils south of the highway looked all right. The canola on the light soils in the northeast part of the county looked the way canola looks when it is run out of patience. Vivian's fields went dry too. She was honest about that with anyone who asked, and a few people did ask because by 2006, the story about the barrels in the buffer strips had been traveling long enough that people were curious about how it would hold up under pressure. Her fields went dry, but they went dry later. The south field, the one with the buffer strips and the rebuilt margins, held its soil moisture into the 3rd week of July before the grass showed stress. The North Quarter, the one she had been treating since 2003, did not show surface cracking until August. The fields around her showed cracking in the 2nd week of July. This was not invisible. You could see it from the road if you knew what you were looking at. And in central Alberta, in 2006, most people knew what cracked soil looked like. Ray Elwick drove past her place on a Tuesday in late July and slowed down without quite stopping. He could see the difference between her south field and his own. He drove home and said nothing. He had a particular silence for the times when he thought he might have been wrong about something. Gordon Smedley drove past on a Friday. Gordon had a good eye for crop stress. He'd been looking at fields in this county for 30 years. What he saw from the road was that Vivian Marsh's grass was a different color than everything adjacent to it. Not dramatically different, not miraculously different, but different in the way that makes a man with 30 years of field reading experience feel a small, uncomfortable thing in his chest. He told himself it was microclimate. The property sat in a slight depression. That could explain it. He drove on. Chloe Arsenault came back in August with her infiltrometer and her colleague and spent 3 days on the property and 2 days on the surrounding parcels. She sent her preliminary numbers to Vivian in October. In the treated sections of Vivian's North Quarter, volumetric soil moisture at 20 centimeters depth was 19% higher than in comparable untreated sections of neighboring properties during the period of lowest precipitation. Organic matter percentages had continued to improve. Root depth in the buffer strip grass species averaged 34 centimeters, compared to 18 centimeters in the continuously managed margins on the adjacent land. "How much of this is the depression in the topography?" Vivian asked. "We controlled for it," Chloe said. "That's not what you're seeing." Vivian put the notebook away. She went to the barn and fed the horses and stood in the doorway and looked at the dark, the way you look at a thing when you have been patient for a long time, and patience has finally paid what it owed. The winter of 2006 to 2007 was long. A hard January ice storm glazed every fence wire and dugout rim in Clearwater County. February was the kind of cold that makes the propane bills frightening. In March, the Clearwater County Agricultural Society held its annual meeting in the community hall at Bowdoin. 60-some producers attended. The agenda ran 2 crop insurance updates, infrastructure funding, a proposal for a new approach road near the north boundary of the municipality, and a brief discussion of a provincial soil conservation incentive program. Vivian attended. She sat near the side wall. She did not speak. She had never spoken at one of these meetings. That was not because she had nothing to say. Near the end of the meeting, a grain farmer named Len Hukelak, who ran a large operation out of the west end of the county, mentioned that he'd received information about a federal provincial cost-share program for soil organic matter improvement. He had the brochure. He didn't know if anyone in the room was doing anything along those lines. He held it up. Anyone working with biological amendments? There was a short pause. That's what Vivian Marsh has been doing. Ray Elwick said it matter-of-factly, the way you state something you have known for a while and have been waiting for the right moment to say. Then he looked across the room toward the sidewall. 60 heads turned. Vivian looked at Ray. She looked at Len Hukelak and the brochure in his hand, which was from the same federal agency whose materials she had first read in 2002. How long? Len asked. Since 2003, she said. 4 years of field application. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the furniture of a conversation has just been moved without warning and everyone is recalibrating where to stand. Well, Len said, I'd like to understand what you've been doing. What happened over the following 3 months was not a transformation. It was a series of conversations. Len Hukelak drove out to Vivian's place in April with his farm manager and walked both fields for 2 hours, saying little, looking at the ground the way experienced farmers look at ground. Not at the top of it, but into it, at color and texture and the way it responded to a boot heel. He asked about the buffer strip seeding mix and the cost per acre. He asked about the inoculant source and application timing. He stood for a long time at the edge of the north quarter where the drainage behavior had changed and looked at the soil profile she had cut for him with a spade. My dad used to say the best compliment you could pay a piece of land was to be able to dig into it without a bar, he said, like it was willing. Vivian said nothing. He pressed his hand flat on the cut face of the soil. This goes in easy, he said. He ordered his first supply of biological inoculant in May. Ray Elwick came by in late April, a Saturday, without calling first. He found her replacing a section of perimeter fence on the east boundary and helped without being asked, the two of them working down the line in the clear April cold. When the section was done, he said, I watched your fields for 4 years, Vivian. She waited. I told people I thought the barrel system was a good idea gone sideways, he said. I said that to more than one person. I know, she said. I talked to that student who had out from Edmonton, he said. Arsenal. She's good, Vivian said. Ask her about the infiltration numbers. Gordon Smedley was last. Gordon had the furthest to travel, because Gordon had been the one who kept the story alive at the elevator for 4 years, who had explained Vivian's system to every producer who came in the door as a cautionary tale about letting academic ideas get too far ahead of practical experience. Gordon Smedley came to Vivian's door on a Saturday morning in May of 2007 with a jar of his wife's rhubarb jam and stood on the step and handed it to her. My south quarter looks like the road allowance, he said. Yours doesn't. Vivian held the jam and looked at him. Come in, she said. I'll put the kettle on and show you the notebook. Let me tell you about the summer of 2007, because the summer of 2007 was the year the story stopped traveling the way it had been traveling. July 2007 brought the driest conditions Clearwater County had seen since 2002. It was not a disaster drought. It was the kind of sustained dry that measures the character of the land below the surface, the kind that you cannot manage your way through in a single season, only over many seasons of preparation. By the 3rd week of July, the fields across the county were showing it in the way that had become familiar. The light soils first, then the heavier, then the pastures on the shallower ground along the creek margins. Hay yields were projected at 50 to 60% of average across the region. On Vivian's land, the grass went dormant. She was clear on this with anyone who asked, and more people were asking now. Her grass went dormant. She was not running a demonstration of exceptional luck or exceptional soil type. She was running 900 acres of Clearwater County land the same as anyone else, but the dormancy happened differently. In the buffer strip margins, the native grass did not go prostrate the way tamed grass goes prostrate in a drought. Flat, brown, not quite dead, but not quite alive. It went summer dormant the way native prairie grass does, drawing down into its root system, conserving at depth, holding the topsoil in place with the root architecture that had evolved for exactly this kind of summer. Her haying margins, the ones she hadn't cut for 3 years now, were standing in July while the adjacent fence-line growth on neighboring properties had been grazed or dried to nothing. Her north quarter drained correctly through the dry period. The low spot that had been a late-season liability for as long as anyone could remember did not become a hard pan. It stayed workable. She did not sell any cows that summer. She did not call the feed supplier for emergency hay. She finished the hay that was there, and it was short, the way everyone's hay was short, but it was enough, and she had enough stored from the previous 2 good years to carry through. Len Hukelak stopped at her gate on a Thursday in late July. He stood at the fence line for a while looking at the difference between her south field margin and his, which shared a fence line and therefore shared the same July. He drove home and called his son in Red Deer and told him to drive out and look before the rain came. The story that had been traveling from the elevator to the rink to the curling club for 5 years was traveling again in August of 2007. But it had changed. It was no longer the story about the widow with the green barrels who had gotten hold of a university idea. It was becoming a different story, the kind of story that a community tells when it is adjusting to the fact that one of its members was right about something they had agreed she was wrong about. These stories travel more quietly than the first kind. They move with a certain deliberateness. They get told in short sentences. Gordon Smedley put a display of biological soil amendment products on the front counter of the elevator in September. He'd sourced them from the same Lethbridge supplier Vivian had used in 2003. He didn't make a sign for them. He didn't need to. Chloe Arsenault came back in September with a colleague and a new set of protocols and spent 2 weeks documenting what had happened across the county over the summer. She published her findings the following year in a Prairie Agriculture journal. The paper was titled Differential Soil Moisture Retention Under Biological Amendment and Buffer Strip Management, Evidence from Central Alberta Field Trials, 2003-2007. Vivian Marsh was named as a collaborating producer. She had agreed to this after thinking about it for 10 days. In November of 2007, the Clearwater County Agricultural Society called a special session. Not the annual meeting. A special session, requested by Len Hukelak, for the purpose of hearing from Vivian Marsh about what she had been doing on her land since 2003. 71 producers attended. That was 40 more than had come to the annual meeting in March. Vivian had not prepared remarks. She had the green notebook, which she had taken out of the filing cabinet the night before and carried under her arm because it seemed like the right thing to bring. She had a copy of Chloe Arsenault's preliminary findings. She had, for reasons she didn't entirely explain when someone asked about it afterward, her father's green notebook from 1987, Harold Whitmore's handwriting on the cover, and his 40 years of watching his own land inside it. She stood at the front of the community hall and opened the notebook and explained what she had done, year by year, from the barrels to the pipe to the buffer strips to the inoculant schedule. She spoke plainly because she did not know how to speak any other way about land. She showed them Chloe's numbers. She told them about the summer of 2007 and what she had and had not needed to buy. She told them that she was not telling them their operations needed to look like hers, because every quarter section in Clearwater County had different soil type and different drainage behavior and different history, and what worked on her north quarter might not work the same way on anyone else's north quarter. When she finished, Len Hukelak asked the first question. Gordon Smedley asked the second. Ray Elwick didn't ask a question. He sat with his arms folded and nodded slowly at the floor. The questions went on for more than an hour. Vivian answered all of them. She said, "I don't know," 4 times and wrote down the names of people who might know so she could send them the contact information later. Near the end, Gordon Smedley, who had been leaning against the back wall and who had been the unofficial narrator of the barrel story for 5 years, cleared his throat and raised his hand. "Vivian," he said, "those first 2 winters, when you had the pipe going into the field instead of out of it, and the barrels on the machine shed and the rest of it, did you ever think you were on the wrong track?" The room went quiet. Vivian looked at Gordon Smedley for a moment. "Every season," she said. "That's why I kept the measurements." The room stayed quiet for a moment longer than usual, the kind of quiet that settles over a space when something true has been said plainly and there's nothing useful to add to it. By 2009, 11 operations in Clearwater County had implemented some version of biological soil amendment or permanent buffer strip management. Not all of them were doing it the same way Vivian had done it, and not all of them were seeing the same results, because the results require patience and consistency and a willingness to look at the field the way her father had taught her to look at it, which is to look at it until you see what it's actually saying rather than what you want it to say. But 11 operations were trying. Len Hukulak was one of them. By 2010, Len had buffer strips on 3/4 and had shifted his inoculant program to the full rotation. His south field, which had been losing organic matter since the 1990s, had reversed that loss. He did not say so publicly until the 3rd season he could measure it. Ray Alex started in the spring of 2008. He did it carefully, 1/4 at a time, checking in with Vivian by phone in the evenings when he had questions. Their conversations were long and specific, and they had a quality that surprised Ray, which was that Vivian never made him feel foolish for asking something he should perhaps have asked earlier. She just answered. Gordon Smedley started in 2009. He was the most thorough once he started, which was not surprising. He drove to Lethbridge himself to talk to the supplier Vivian had used since 2003. He came back and told his wife that the man knew his business. Chloe Arsenault finished her doctorate in 2008. One chapter examined Vivian's operation in detail under the title Long-Term Biological Infiltration Enhancement in the Foothills Transition Zone, a producer-led case study. The language was the careful language of science, which is to say it understated what had actually happened on those 900 acres in the way that precise language sometimes has to understate things that are not precise. What it said, in the plain terms underneath the technical ones, was that 5 years of biological amendment and buffer management had produced statistically significant improvements in soil health and water retention on the marsh property that were consistent with the predictions of the research and inconsistent with the assumptions of conventional dryland management. Vivian read the chapter twice. The second time she read it, she thought her father would have found the language funny. He would have looked at the data tables and nodded, and then walked out to the field and pushed his hand into the soil and said, "Well, it goes in easy. That's the whole thing." In the spring of 2010, the county extension office, the same office whose agricultural fieldman had handed Chloe Arsenault a skeptical look and a name in 2005, held a field day at the Marsh property. 63 producers came from across the region. They arrived in half-tons and parked along the township road and walked in through the gate the way farmers walk into a field they're being invited to judge, which is carefully and with their eyes already open. Vivian met them at the gate and took them to the north quarter first. The low spot that had been a liability since before she'd taken over the operation. She showed them the drainage behavior. She showed them the soil profile, cut fresh that morning with a spade. She let them put their hands into it. An older producer from the south end of the county, a man who had been running a mixed operation since before Vivian was born, pushed his hand flat into the soil and held it there for a moment. Then he walked to the fence line and pressed his hand into the soil on the other side of it, in the uncorrected section that abutted the neighbor's fence. He stood there for a while. "It's like 2 different provinces," he said finally. "Same county," Vivian said. "Same soil type, 7 years." The man straightened up. He looked at the fence line. He took his hat off and turned it slowly in his hands. "My grandfather farmed on this kind of soil for his whole life," he said. "He thought the ground just did what the ground did. You couldn't argue with it." "Mine thought the same thing," Vivian said. "He watched it more carefully than most. But he didn't know what he was watching." "What made you think you did?" Vivian looked at the field for a moment. "I didn't," she said. "I just started writing it down." She gave him the name of the Saskatchewan researcher and the Manitoba organization and the Lethbridge supplier, written on a notepad page from the breast pocket of her jacket. The man folded it and put it in his coat. "I've got a quarter on the east side," he said. "Went tight in '02 and never really came back." He looked at the soil profile she had cut. "I'm 67 years old. You think there's enough time?" Vivian looked at him. "It took 7 years to get here," she said. "You'll see most of it." He put his hat back on. They stood in the field together, the 63 producers and Vivian Marsh, looking at the land that 7 years ago had been tight and gray and shedding water it couldn't hold. The land that almost everyone who drove the township road had assumed would always be that way, because it had always been that way, and because change in a field is slow enough to be invisible to anyone who isn't watching every inch of it with the patience of someone who was taught, a long time ago, that you haven't looked at a thing until you understand what it's trying to tell you. The Alberta sky was doing what it does in April, which is everything at once, clear and cold and bright and threatening, all of it moving fast from the west. The grass in the buffer strips moved with it. Not bending, just present in it, the way something moves when it has put down enough roots to meet the wind without argument. Vivian watched it, the way her father had taught her, which is the way you watch a thing you have made a long and patient agreement with. It had cost her 12 green barrels, 4 rolls of perforated pipe, and a biological inoculant that nobody at the Olds farm and feed had ever stocked. It had cost her 5 years of being the quiet subject of a story that traveled from the elevator to the rink to the curling club and back. It had cost her the particular kind of solitude that belongs to people who are watching something that nobody else can see yet. And then the ground had changed, slowly, measurably, without drama, the way the best changes happen, which is so gradually that one day you push your hand into the soil and realize it goes in easy, and you understand that easy is not how it started, and you know exactly what the difference cost, and you know it was worth it. That is what it looks like when someone stops managing the symptoms and starts paying attention to the cause. The question people asked afterward was how she'd known it would work. That was the wrong question. The right question was why the water had been running off in the first place. And the answer to that was written in a green notebook in the equipment shed. 7 years of Vivian Marsh watching her land the way her father had taught her to watch it. Which is the way you watch something until you stop seeing what you expect and start seeing what is actually there. What stays with me about Vivian Marsh isn't the moment the county finally came around. It's the winters before that. The ones where she drove home from the elevator knowing people were talking, filed her notebook in the back bedroom, and went out to check the water troughs anyway. There's a kind of cause and effect in stories like this that we don't always want to sit with, because it's slow and it doesn't make for a clean timeline. Vivian didn't do one courageous thing and get rewarded for it. She did the same careful thing, over and over, for 7 years, in conditions that gave her no guarantee it was working. The drainage improved because she kept the measurements. The soil changed because she kept the measurements. Gordon Smedley came to her door with rhubarb jam because she had been right, and she had been right because she had been watching. And she had been watching because her father had taught her that you don't see a field by driving past it. That's the chain. That's all it is. I think about the integrity of it, not integrity in the way we sometimes use that word, as a kind of public virtue, something performed for an audience. The integrity Vivian had was quieter than that. It was the integrity of writing down what she actually saw, not what she hoped she was seeing, of saying, "I don't know," 4 times in front of 60 producers and then writing down the names of people who did. Of never once making Ray Elwick or Gordon Smedley feel small for asking the questions they should have asked years earlier. That kind of integrity doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates the way organic matter accumulates in soil, slowly, invisibly, until one day you push your hand into the ground and feel how much easier it goes. And the intelligence she brought to it wasn't the intelligence of someone who had all the answers. It was something more useful, the intelligence of someone who knew what questions to keep asking. She read the Saskatchewan manual. She called the Manitoba researchers. She had long, specific telephone conversations with producers she'd never met, because she understood that what she was trying to do was bigger than one woman's 900 acres, and she needed to know what other people were learning. Curiosity like that doesn't run out. It compounds. What I find hardest to hold on to and the most worth holding on to is the endurance of it. Not the dramatic endurance of someone fighting against an enemy, the ordinary, daily endurance of someone who got up every morning for 7 years and kept doing the thing that nobody around her could see the point of yet. The barrels went in the fall of 2003. The county story about those barrels ran for 5 years. Vivian was the punchline and the answer at the same time, and she knew it, and she kept the notebook anyway. The man who came to her field day at 67 years old and asked if he had enough time left. I think about him too. Because the real question under that question was whether it was worth starting something you might not finish. And Vivian told him the truth, which is the only real answer. You'll see most of it. Most of it is enough. Most of it is almost always enough. The field changed because one woman decided to pay attention to it. That's all that happened. And that is not a small thing.